question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to make some comments tonight on the Higher Education and Research Reform Bill. Labor will be opposing this bill, and that is because this is the same toxic piece of public policy that it's always been. It's the same $100,000 degrees, and it will lead to the same settings that will prevent young people in my electorate of Hotham from pursuing that dream of going to university. Of course, Deputy Speaker, we are opposed to this bill because it flies in the face of everything that we believe in this side of the House about education.
Order.
As Labor people, it strikes right to the core of who we are and the country that we represent. What those on the other side of the House will never understand is that education means everything to us as Labor people. This is how we make an equal Australia. This is how we ensure that our economy continues to grow. It is at the very heart of the Labor dream that a child who is growing up in my electorate, perhaps in a migrant home, can go to a good quality public school and will have the chance, that great chance, to go on to university, and hopefully one day that great chance to do something like serve in a chamber like this. Now, when we restrict access to university in the way that this bill is proposing, we say that that is not what we want in Australia anymore, that that's not the Australia that we want to live in. Labor will not stand for that. We will not stand for extinguishing the opportunities for young people who are in that position. Now, that's why I'm actually very confident standing up here and making these comments tonight that I'm reflecting the views in my community. When I talk to people in Hotham, this is really what they're worried about. They do not want to be in a situation where families right across the country are having to think about starting savings accounts for their children when they're born to pay for their college education, as we see so commonly in other parts of the world. Deputy Speaker, I'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics of what is in the bill. Now, I said essentially it's the same package that we've been debating in this House, and that, unfortunately for those on the other side, a debate that they've been losing for the last 8 months. The same basic principle that universities will be able to charge whatever they want for the studies that they offer, and that will lead to $100,000 degrees. We also know that this is going to have a particular impact on the sustainability of regional universities. It's been generally accepted in this debate that there are regional campuses that are going to have to close. Again, Deputy Speaker, not something that Labor is willing to put up with. We want people, young people from right around the country, to be able to study and to study depending on whether they live in regional areas or not. What we will see as a consequence of this bill is a two-tiered education system, an education system where there are some universities that cater to wealthy Australians that get those great world-class get themselves on the great world-class metrics, and we're going to have other universities which are affordable universities. And I think we know, Deputy Speaker, which ones the first class, the best quality education is going to be delivered in. Now, there is one or two important changes that have been made in the legislation from the last draft that we considered as a House, and one of the critical ones that I want to discuss in a little bit of detail is about the change to the way that the interest rate on student loans would be set. We know that the initial proposal from the Minister for Education was that student debts would be gain interest according to the bond rate. So this was the situation that would see a woman who went through university, perhaps studied engineering or even something like nursing, who might take a few years out to look after children, and then be in the position where they would never be able to pay the cost of their degree in their lifetime, in their working lifetime. And we saw particularly, Deputy Speaker, the impact that this would have on women because they were taking those years out of work. Now, in the legislation before us, we've seen the Minister for Education make a pretty significant change in policy, which is that instead of setting the interest rate at the bond rate, it will go back to CPI. So in some ways this is a significant shift, and in other ways it isn't. We see that some of the gross unfairness that we were going to see people's debt rise by has been in part dealt with. I would say all the things that I've talked about, the $100,000 degree, the threats to regional universities, will remain. But one of the things it does do, Deputy Speaker, is blow a massive hole in the savings that were meant to be the result of the proposals before us. So instead of saving $3.9 billion each year, we save $0.4 billion each year. So let's just let that sink in. 9 out of $10 that the minister went around and talked to everyone about the excitement of saving the budget and all the things that he was doing to try to get the budget under control, 9 out of 10 of those dollars are gone now because of this change. So this bill now makes all of those changes to our system, making our system so much more unfair, making access so much more limited, and yet we don't really make much savings from it. So if anything, this is actually an even worse piece of public policy than the one that the minister introduced when we saw the budget introduced in conjunction with the budget last year. I actually can't believe it. The same terrible policy, and yet we make hardly any savings. This is absolutely ridiculous, Deputy Speaker. Now, this is not all that the bill does. I want to speak in a little bit more detail about some of the specific additional things that I'm concerned about here. So, as part of the policy framework here, we're seeing a $1.9 billion cut to Australian universities. We're seeing a $171 million cut for equity programs. We're seeing a $200 million cut in indexation of grants programs, $170 million in cuts to research training. I mean, Deputy Speaker, can you think of anything more economically backwards than going around and cutting funding for our scientists and researchers, as this government seems to want to do? Another element I find particularly disturbing is that for the first time in Australia, under this bill, PhDs will be charged to study. Now, Deputy Speaker, these are the brightest minds in the country, and what we're doing is telling them that's something they can do all over the world with subsidies from the university because their research is so important. They're now going to be charged to do in Australia. And in addition, we see $80 billion in cuts for the Australian Research Council. Now, when you add all these things up, what I see here is pretty much the worst thing you could do to an economy that is in the position of Australia's economy now, and especially when we think about the long term. Because a lot of these proposals that I'm finding so concerning, and on behalf of my constituents that I'm making those views known tonight, is about the long term. So this is a government that we've seen is taking away funding to scientists, funding to the CSIRO, funding for researchers, and trying to put this additional cost on individuals who are going out and trying to get themselves educated. What is so disturbing about this is that what we want to build Australia's economy in the long term is every Australian to go as far in the education system as they can, as their wits will allow them. And yet here we see an additional cost being imposed on every Australian who wants to do that. What we want is for science to be supported so that we've got something that we can rely on in the future when we're outside the context of a mining boom, as we will be very shortly. So I see, Deputy Speaker, this as being basically a disaster for the economy, especially when you take into account the context that the key savings measure is gone from this bill. I can't believe it. I actually can't believe that the minister is even putting this before the parliament. So we've talked about issues around the impact on the economy, and I mentioned particularly in the long term. But of course, the other critical thing for us Labor people is that this policy is just plain unfair. We need to remember that the cabinet that is putting this policy forward contains 12 people who went to university completely for free. And yet what they are trying to do is put in place a policy that will ensure that other Australians don't get not only the opportunity for free education, but the opportunity for affordable education. This is just outrageous. Now, we're starting to hear a little bit of rhetoric from this government about intergenerational equality. I honestly don't know who these people think that they are fooling, Deputy Speaker, because what they're doing is they're trying to charge younger generations of Australians for education astronomically, putting these prices on these degrees that many Australians won't be able to afford. They're not taking serious action on climate, allowing our environment to degrade, and taking away important things that will drive long-term economic growth in our country. Under the policies, when you put them all together, what we see that the vision that this government has for Australia is one that is less equal, it is growing less quickly, and we have a degraded environment and a lower quality of life. Now, I reject all of these things. I reject all of these things. What we need is to look after our next generation by investing in them, by giving them the skills and the capabilities that they need to build a great life for themselves. Now, we're not going to do that, Deputy Speaker, by putting this extreme additional cost on the cost of themselves getting educated. Now, we have had the argument refuted, of course, from the other side, and I'm sure we'll hear more speakers talk about how, this won't really make a difference. Low-income families won't be deterred by $100,000 degrees. This is untrue. It's absolutely not the case, Deputy Speaker, because the argument that $100,000 degrees is not going to deter young people from studying defies expert opinion and it defies common sense, I think, if you ask any Australian. So even in Australia, where we've seen fees changed over time, a recent study by Deloitte Access Economics actually found that past experiences of raising fees in Australia has seen a decline in demand for education, and an 8% decline in demand. What's quite interesting is that all of that decline in demand has come from young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, I absolutely hear this reiterated by local principals that I talk to in my electorate, Deputy Speaker, because their frustration at this policy is absolutely palpable. What they say to me is that the amounts that are being talked about, this is a quote of one of my local principals, will absolutely scare my students away. For these kids, a sum like $100,000 is a Tats Lotto win. It's an unimaginable amount of money. Now, Deputy Speaker, what perhaps some on the other side of the House don't appreciate is that we have got people who live in my community of Hotham, people who I come into this chamber every day to represent, who are on incomes that are less than half of what the degree will cost, supporting relatively large families. Now, these families are not going to consider $100,000 to be just a simply absorbable cost, like we might see from people in other electorates in other parts of Australia. Now, what we actually hear from these local principals is that I know in the world that some other members may live in, everyone's parents are at home encouraging them with the importance of education and talking to them about their need to stay at school for as long as they want. But there are lots of kids who live in my electorate who actually don't have their families saying to them, who have families at home saying, please, you need to be earning so you're helping our family now. Now, for those kids, these are not families that are going to think that $100,000 is an amount of money that they can afford for their kids to go to university. That's just ridiculous. Now, something else that I have talked to about local principals is that, for sure, there'll be this sort of shorter-term impact of kids who are going into the end of their secondary years now, and of course they're not going to be as excited about going to university when they're going to be saddled by this enormous debt. But what the principals are actually most concerned about is a change to the culture over time, because what these rules say to them is that education is for families who can deal with these amounts of money. Those families are not the ones that go to some of the schools in my electorate. What this policy says to us is that through this kind of scholarship scheme, which is this, throwaway to the people who can't afford through their families to pay fees, that this is going to resolve the equity question. But not all the kids in these schools are going to get these scholarships. What it's saying to them is that it's fine for families that can afford it. There's much broader access to education for those families. But in these really struggling households, it's only a few of the best and brightest that will get to go to our best universities. Now, in Australia, this is just not how we do things, and I don't think that most Australians want to see that changed, Deputy Speaker. We want our country to be a meritocracy, Deputy Speaker. That is what Labor stands for. We want to live in a community and a society where young people all around the country believe that their skills and their capacities will be equally valued, and that the government will be just as enthusiastic about getting the best out of those young people as they are about getting the best out of young people who are trying to get degrees but have families who are able to pay those exorbitant fees that we're going to see as a result of these policies. It is absolutely anathema to the Australia that, as Labor people, we want to live in. So I would just say to those on the other side of the House, I can understand that in different types of communities you might not experience these, you might not have schools like those in those really disadvantaged parts of my electorate, but this is just the honest truth, that when I talk to those principals, they're extremely worried, they're extremely concerned. When I talk to young people who live in regional Australia, I hear the same types of messages. We know that there are lots of young people in regional communities who study at regional universities who would not study were the university not there. We can't just assume that all young people are equally mobile and able to move into the city when they want to take up that opportunity to go off to university. So I just say, Deputy Speaker, I'm really proud to stand today and say that on behalf of the people of Hotham, I absolutely oppose the measures in this bill. It's bad policy. It was bad policy to begin with, made perhaps only worse by the fact that the savings measures in this bill, by and large, are now gone. So now we have a dramatic change to the way education is funded in Australia that puts costs onto families and costs onto students, and we don't get much back by way of savings. It was bad policy to begin with, it's bad policy now, and I'm proud to say that I don't support it.
I thank the honourable member for